So in making an evaluation of feminist views of solutions to crime, so we're looking at outline and assess sociological explanations of solutions to crime. We've gone through several perspectives. We've gone through feminism, we're going to evaluate feminism. So feminist solutions to crime involved looking at challenging patriarchy, making sure women were safe. Some feminists argue that women should be safe and have equality with men. And we can evaluate feminists. How could we evaluate feminist views of solutions to crime?
You could say that the victims still need to be discovered because there are some people who some crimes are unreported. So for you to find a solution to crime, you need to first find out where the crime is actually taking place.
Okay. Would that fit in with the feminist view that crimes are hidden in the private sphere of the family?
Yeah.
Okay, so that would support feminists.
Oh yeah, okay.
Okay.
You said evaluation.
Yeah. So we could put the left realists would support, they'd say there's strengths in feminism because they support the idea of patriarchy being a problem. And so there's like hidden domestic violence, which is a serious issue. Victims often come from marginalised backgrounds, deprived backgrounds. Left realists are concerned about inequality. But the left realists would probably say the feminists should go further. What do you think the left realists would say we need to look at as well as the gender of the victims?
The solutions to crime and how to sort of make the victims better.
Yeah, how to restore the victims, make them feel better. So the left realists we're going to look at next, okay? So we are going to talk about the left realists next, and we'll talk about restorative justice and how that works. Some of the feminists argue for shaming of offenders. So there's actually there's been this video on YouTube, and there's a website. Remember the website that is focused on trying to name and shame offenders, where you take pictures of someone who's harassed you. That's online.
It's to do with everyday sexism.
Everyday sexism. And there's a video of a woman walking through New York over 10 hours. They've filmed how men are supposedly harassing this young woman. Left realists argue gender is important, patriarchy is an issue. We also need to look at marginalisation. In terms of class and other issues, therefore, it's important to look at the range of issues. Influenced by postmodernists who focus on intersectionality. Left realists and black feminists like bell hooks. _B_H. We need to look not only at patriarchy but also victimisation as a result of issues like class, racism, and so solutions to crime lie in analysing how society is white, imperialist, patriarchal capitalism, according to bell hooks. So the feminists could be seen as overplaying gender and underplaying other factors. The right realists would criticise feminists for overplaying society and the culture of society and patriarchy, and for underplaying. What do you think the right realists would say we need to look at? Not only the culture of society and patriarchy, what do you think the right realists would say is important? Do you remember the thing from your essay?
Right realists. Would they say emphasise on the individual?
Individual. So the feminists underplay.
And that people choose to commit crime because the benefits outweigh the costs.
Okay, so the feminists argue that the culture of patriarchy, structures, sex divided society is a problem, which explains crime needs to be solved, create gender equality. The right realists would actually say that this overplays, society and culture and structure, underplays individual choices in terms of benefits and costs. People make this rational choice where they weigh those up. So people like Wilson argue that the feminists overplay the issue of patriarchy and ignore the choices that people make. That includes females in terms of their choices about their behaviour and lifestyle. And so right realists have criticised feminists. Camille Paglia, argues that the feminists have sold women a myth of equality, and that in reality women do need to take responsibility rather than just arguing they've got rights. So we've evaluated feminists. Now we're going to go into left realism, do a bit of work on left realism, evaluate left realism, and then right realism and new right, and evaluate them.
They focus on the organisation of society and especially the inequality, disadvantage and poverty that result from this.
Okay, so left realists focus on organisation of society. They look at poverty.
Yeah, and inequality.
And inequality. And so, as we said before, the strategy for dealing with the solutions to crime question is to consider
the victim.
Yeah, the left realists look at the victim, but generally, the general strategy with any solutions to crime question, with any perspective, is to look at the explanation of crime, and then to look at the solution, which would be to do with dealing with that cause of crime. Okay, so they're going to look. They do look at the victim as well, the left realists. So they're looking at the way in which society is organised. They think there should be more social justice and fairness, because issues like poverty and inequality are a result of capitalism. That said, society has changed. There's more fragmentation and uncertainty about status. And so, rather than just saying the problem is poverty in terms of absolute poverty, a lack of material resources, the problem is actually relative poverty, a sense or feeling that you're deprived compared to others. This is a particular problem in cities, where the problem of people living in close proximity together. And in cities, you have more crime, more urban crime, because the rich and the poor, the relatively rich and the relatively poor, those who are, more wealthy and less wealthy compared to each other, are living closer together. That creates more of this sense of being deprived compared to others. So we need to deal with that issue. Part of the problem is that the media exaggerates this sense of deprivation because it sells us the values of materialism and self-importance and having material possessions. So partly through the media we need to challenge this culture of materialism. We need to also deal with the victims who have often been ignored by theories in the past. The left realists are critical of earlier theories like functionalists and the Marxists, who focus more on the offenders, and they often underplay the importance of the harm caused to victims. And so the left realists argue there are several ways to deal with crime. It's not just policing, but actual community-based policing. So the left realists don't believe in military-style policing, where you have stop and search, interrogation, you have visible police on the streets. The left realists say that swamping an area with police, like the Swamp 81 operation 1981 Brixton riots, that actually created more marginalisation and it didn't reduce crime. And so in fact we need to do community-based policing, where we work with the public to find out their concerns and what they're worried about, so that the police can investigate crime effectively. Whereas with military-style policing, with investigating based on stop and search, communities feel marginalised. They don't help police, and that doesn't actually solve crime. The left realists believe in helping victims and involving them in the criminal justice process. Restorative justice involves
encouraging offenders to take responsibility for their actions.
Encouraging offenders to take responsibility for their actions. Excellent. So we've got this idea that 27% drop in recidivism rate is a result of this kind of process. For example, victim-offender mediation, where victims and offenders meet with someone mediating the discussion. The offender may apologise, may understand what they've done and how it's harmed the victim. The victim is able to talk about the impact of the crime upon them, and so that they can reach resolution and deal with their feelings. And they can feel safer, and it leads to what we call reintegrative shaming. So the left realists like Jock Young believe we have a kind of bulimic model of solutions to crime where we lock people away, but that's actually just trying to purge society of these unwanted elements, whereas in fact we need to reintegrate people who have offended back into society so they can be successful, they're less likely to reoffend. Since the reoffending rate is 50%, half of offenders reoffend anyway, prison doesn't seem to work. So that's the left realist approach. The left realists can be criticised. How can we criticise the left realists?
You could say they focus too much on the victim.
They focus too much on the victim?
And less on the cause of crime.
Okay. So don't explain the causes of crime adequately. Yes, you could support that, because some thinkers have argued that left realists over-predict crime by focusing on relative deprivation, marginalisation, subcultures. There actually would be more crime if the left realists were correct. But in fact, since the mid-1990s, crime has actually declined, which suggests the left realists were over-predicting crime. Perhaps crime is caused by other issues. For example, the right realists would say the left realists blame society too much and overplay the causes in the structure of society. The right realists would argue that crime is basically down to an individual choice. So the left realists are, again, overly critical of society and are too critical of the social structure. So that leads us into the last main approach I want to look at, which is the right realist, new right approach. Okay, the right realist approach is basically the same as the new right. People often ask why that is and how that can be. The new right is political ideology, so it's a belief system which combines liberalism and conservatism. Probably more accurately, neoliberalism and neoconservatism. And this neoliberal, neoconservative approach argues that people should be individually self-responsible and not just argue they've got rights and not just rely on welfare and blame the system. They should blame themselves and take responsibility. The neoconservative approach is about conserving tradition, keeping a strong family, a strong state, punishing crime where necessary. The right realist approach is essentially the new right's view on crime. So it's an approach to crime. And in the 1980s, we saw the new right start to analyse crime. Wilson and Herrnstein look at the idea of choices. We've got Wilson's broken windows thesis, where we look at how crime is a result of the environment. Can you just explain the broken windows thesis?
If signs of disorder, such as a few broken windows, are left unrepaired or graffiti is not removed, it encourages further similar deviance.
Okay, so we've got disorder in the environment, broken windows, graffiti on walls and so on. These show that the environment is not valued, and so the community does not, the values are not there in the community. And so there's this idea of social disorganisation. This would be supported by the concept of anomie from functionalists, where there's a lack of norms, there's no clear social norms which structure behaviour. This leads to people being unable to apply informal social controls, which would normally control behaviour in the community. The argument is therefore that we need to introduce more control. We need to control human behaviour. This is based on the view of human nature, which is a Hobbesian view of human nature, that human beings are selfish, and ultimately life in a state of nature would be nasty, brutish and short. Therefore need to ensure that human nature is controlled. This means there needs to be a strong culture, and needs to be strong controls in place. People need to be responsible for their own individual behaviour rather than blaming the system and making excuses for their behaviour. The right realists are therefore very critical of the conflict theories of Marxism and feminism and left realism, which argue that it's the competition between groups and exploitation which lead to crime. The right realists would argue it's to do with individual choices, a lack of control over human behaviour. It's not to do with too much control or too much reaction. It's to do with not enough reaction, not enough control, and a soft approach to crime. The right realists can be criticised themselves. How could we criticise the right realists?
You could say, well, Marxists would say that the SCP, the Situational Crime Prevention, creates a new type of social inequality.
Okay, so you're using an evaluation point, although I didn't mention situational crime prevention. So it would have been worth mentioning that if we're going to use that particular evaluation point. We could mention situational crime prevention in the new right section, which is to do with designing out crime. So in trying to deal with the problem with social disorganisation and lack of control, the new right and right realists would argue we need to design out crime. That means we need to harden the targets. We need to make it more difficult to commit crime in the first place. So if there's situations where crime take place more commonly, we can measure that, we can analyse that, and then we can do something to reduce crime. One of the reasons why this is seen as more effective is because the measures in the past to do with reducing poverty were seen as less effective because there was a crime increase after the Second World War, although poverty had decreased. So some measures of target hardening and situational crime prevention include plastic beer glasses in pubs, better locks on people's doors, better alarm systems on cars. However, there are some problems with those views. So the Marxists would say?
The Marxists would say that it ignores white-collar crime, corporate crime and state crimes, and they would say that it creates a new type of social inequality because the rich, the middle class, will be able to afford to invest in making themselves harder targets to crime and design out crime, but the poor will be the main victims.
Okay, so the Marxists would criticise the right realist approach. They'd argue that this ignores white-collar crime because it's focusing on street crime where better locks are needed, etc. It's ignoring crime in the suites, in terms of business suites, in terms of office suites where there's accountants committing fraud, etc. Social inequality, a new type of social inequality would be created by situational crime prevention, where the rich can afford to be harder targets, but the poor are more likely to be victims. So instead of actually reducing crime, this will just displace crime and push it elsewhere. The right realists can be seen as blaming individuals and communities instead of blaming the wider system, which is the cause of these communities' problems, which explain their choices. So we could say that they don't really have choices. Choices are not made in a vacuum, that they are experiencing inequality, exploitation. The right realists are underplaying these problems, and they're blaming individuals and families for problems which are beyond their control. So that evaluates the right realists and leads us to the conclusion. And the conclusion for this essay, we can say that we need to be decisive. So a solution needs to be some kind of a decision. We can try and sound good in the conclusion, or we can try and generally come to a judgment or decision about how to choose which is the best theory on this area. So in this case, the question was outline and assess sociological explanations of solutions to crime. We have got an example of a conclusion.
Conclusion. Do I have a conclusion?
What do you think we could put?
there are many conflicting views on the sociological explanations and solutions to crime. However, right realists seem to have the best one.
All right, okay. You think right realists are the best one? Well, possibly. Yeah, we could give a judgment like that at the end. Essentially, we've covered so much information that the conclusion doesn't need to be that long. So we could give a conclusion which gives a decision where we could say ultimately there are many views. The right realists seem to have the best view. Probably be worth saying why they have the best view.
Because they have situational and environmental crime prevention.
Okay, but you could still argue the right realists may have the most realistic view because they consider the situation and the environment where crime takes place, where people make their choices. However, you could say that this still fundamentally ignores the wider context in which environments are created. For example, the redevelopment of the East End in London has led to the development of more communities where the rich have gated communities, where the poor have small alleyways where no one can look over those areas and see what's happening. So those environments are actually more prone to crime, and that's not the fault of the community themselves.
What's the redevelopment of the East End?
I think that was to do with rich people buying up houses in the East End and you know, getting rid of the working class houses, people moving out of the urban areas, and that's still going on now with the gentrification of London. People are living in houses they can never possibly afford, which you know, so we've got this dwindling working class community. So in summary, you could say that there are a range of views. The right realists give many ideas which focus on the individual, which does seem important, taking into account how we make choices in the moment. This might be supported by postmodernists who do argue that we make choices based on our experience of crime and excitement and our emotions, so it's not rational. That this is a different view to the right realists who argue we make rational decisions that weigh up benefits and costs. Postmodernists argue we may be irrational and our emotions have a part to play. Taking into account the fact of our emotions and self-control, this might then lend weight to the view that the structure of society, our place in terms of social status and gender, are important factors. They're likely to affect our ability to achieve different identities and exercise different forms of self-control, and therefore perhaps the critical views hold the strongest position. That's my position, my position or suggestion, personal suggestion. Hope this has been helpful. If any questions, email daniel_butcher@hotmail.co.uk. Very good. All right.